Lake Peigneur, prior to 1980, was an unremarkable body of water in Iberia Parish, Louisiana. Only about 11 feet deep on average, it was the kind of lake that faded into the background of daily life, known mostly to locals, fishermen, and the workers at the salt mine that had tunneled beneath its floor for nearly a century. It wasn't grand or especially beautiful, but it had a kind of quiet familiarity. Surrounded by moss-draped cypress trees and modest homes, it was the kind of place where you didn't expect surprises. But to understand what happened at Lake Peigneur, you have to understand what lay beneath it, one of the strangest and most dangerous combinations of natural and industrial features possible. An underground salt mine and an oil drilling operation, occupying the same patch of land, but separated by over 1,000 vertical feet. The Diamond Crystal Salt Mine, which had been operating since the early 1900s, was a sprawling labyrinth carved deep into the earth. Salt domes, huge column-like formations made of nearly pure rock salt, are a peculiar geological feature found in regions like southern Louisiana and Texas. Formed millions of years ago, these salt structures are the result of ancient seabeds drying out and being buried under layers of sediment. Over time, the pressure from above causes the salt to behave plastically. It can flow, deform, and push upward through the surrounding rock, forming columns or domes. These salt domes are valuable for a few reasons. First, the salt itself can be mined. Second, they often act as traps for oil and natural gas since their impermeable structure prevents hydrocarbons from escaping. As a result, oil companies are often very interested in drilling around or near salt domes, but so are salt mining companies who carve out the domes themselves. That's where the danger begins. By 1980, the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine had carved out a huge multi-level network of tunnels and caverns beneath Lake Peigneur. The mine was extensive, with hundreds of miles of passages. Miners worked in enormous chambers, some over 50 feet tall, supported by thick columns of unmined salt left behind to hold up the weight of the world above. It was an engineering marvel, but one that relied on precise mapping, cautious excavation, and a firm grasp of exactly where every tunnel, shaft, and void existed. Above ground, however, another operation was underway. Texaco, the oil giant, had contracted with a company called Wilson Brothers to drill an exploratory well from a floating platform on the lake. They were searching for oil deposits, likely caught near the edge of the same salt dome that the miners were excavating from below. The well they were drilling was meant to reach thousands of feet into the earth, using a process called rotary drilling. This involves using a drill bit mounted at the end of a long pipe, which is rotated rapidly to cut through rock. As it bores downward, a mixture called drilling mud is pumped through the pipe to cool the drill bit, carry rock cuttings back to the surface, and maintain pressure in the hole to prevent blowouts or collapses. The problem is, rotary drilling is only as safe as the information you're drilling with, and on that quiet November morning, the information was wrong, very wrong. According to later investigations, the coordinates given to the drillers placed their rig safely away from the salt mine. On paper, they were clear by several hundred feet, but somewhere along the way, either through a transcription error, a miscalculation in surveying, or a failure in communication, the drill bit was not where it was supposed to be. Unbeknownst to the crew, it was headed straight for the roof of one of the mine's uppermost chambers. The Texaco drill rig floated peacefully in the middle of the lake. The sky was overcast, the wind low. It was, by all outward appearances, a normal day, but in the black, silent caverns far below, something was about to go catastrophically wrong. At 7:45 a.m. on November 20th, the Wilson Brothers drilling crew on Lake Peigneur had no reason to think anything was out of the ordinary. Their rig, essentially a floating platform stabilized by anchors, was positioned near the center of the lake. The drill had already descended over 1,200 feet into the earth, cutting through layers of sediment, clay, and rock in search of an oil reservoir believed to sit near the edge of the salt dome. But what they didn't know was that they were only a few feet above the cavernous ceiling of the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine's uppermost tunnel. That morning, as the rotating drill bit chewed downward, it punctured the salt dome's roof, something that was never supposed to happen. Salt, as a mineral, behaves very differently from other geological materials when under stress. It's soft and soluble. If exposed to water, it begins to dissolve rapidly. Unlike granite or shale, salt can't resist sustained pressure or moisture. It doesn't fracture, it melts away. So when the drill bit pierced through into the air pocket of the mine and then created a path for water to follow, it didn't just cause a leak, it created a direct pipeline from the lake into the mine, and water always follows the path of least resistance. What happened next defied comprehension. The lake, 11 feet deep, spread across 1,300 acres, began draining into the earth like water down a bathtub. At first, the drilling crew noticed odd noises, sucking sounds, vibrations. Then the platform began to shift. The mud used in the drilling process started to vanish from the well at an alarming rate, as if being pulled away by an invisible vacuum. The crew quickly abandoned the rig, fleeing to shore just before the platform itself began to tilt. Within minutes, it was swallowed completely. Meanwhile, nearly 1,500 feet below the surface, miners in the salt dome noticed something strange. Some of them described hearing a low rumbling, followed by a whoosh, an unmistakable sound of rushing air and then rushing water. For a moment, many of them thought it was just one of the powerful ventilation fans that ran constantly in the mine, but then water began pouring down through the ceiling, fast. What the miners were witnessing was something geologists call a catastrophic mine flood, a scenario where a breach in the ceiling or walls allows an uncontrollable volume of water to enter the mine. These types of floods are rare, but when they happen, they're almost always deadly. Mines are built under the assumption that the ground above is stable. Once that assumption fails, there's often no way to stop the flood. If there are no barriers, no plugs, no time, water simply fills the void. And in this case, the void was immense. The Diamond Crystal Salt Mine wasn't just a tunnel, it was a massive, multi-level system of corridors and chambers stretching for miles. Once water started pouring in from the lake, it accelerated with horrifying speed. The salt walls began to dissolve instantly, widening the breach and allowing more water to enter. The mine's very architecture, its complexity, its scale, now worked against it, offering endless space for the lake to occupy. Miraculously, all 55 miners working that day managed to escape. Some did so by riding the mine's industrial elevator to the surface. Others climbed hundreds of feet up emergency stairwells, their boots slipping on wet steel as water chased them upward. A few were rescued by a man operating a mining cart who made multiple trips into the tunnels to retrieve those left behind. Above ground, things were deteriorating rapidly. The breach had created what's known as a vortex sinkhole, a giant whirlpool forming at the surface of the lake where the water was draining. As the lake emptied into the mine, it pulled with it not just water but everything nearby: boats, trees, rocks, and entire chunks of shoreline. The whirlpool widened and deepened, becoming a churning maelstrom of mud, wood, and machinery. 11 barges, which had been moored nearby for various industrial uses, were pulled into the vortex. The sound was said to be deafening: metal groaning, trees snapping, the slurp of rushing water. Each barge vanished into the spinning hole like toys being flushed down a massive toilet. And it didn't stop there. A 150-foot drilling derrick, a towering steel structure that had stood above the rig, was next to go. It collapsed into the lake and disappeared without a trace. A nearby loading dock, several trucks, a parking lot, and even a large section of the botanical gardens belonging to Jefferson Island, a historic estate on the lake's edge, were all pulled in. And then something even stranger happened. About 12 miles away, the Delcombre Canal connects Lake Peigneur to the Gulf of Mexico. This canal is a man-made waterway used primarily for transporting goods and boats between inland Louisiana and the open sea. Normally, water flows from the lake out to the Gulf, following gravity and elevation. But now, the lake was vanishing, and fast. The sudden drop in elevation and pressure created a phenomenon rarely seen in nature: reverse flow. The canal began running backward. Salt water from the Gulf surged inland, racing up the canal to replace the vanished lake water. This backward flow, pushed by both gravity and hydrodynamic pressure, created a temporary 20-foot waterfall at the canal's mouth, where ocean water plunged into the newly formed vortex in Lake Peigneur. No one had ever seen anything like it. An entire lake, reversed rivers, massive industrial equipment swallowed whole, and yet not a single human life was lost. By mid-morning, Lake Peigneur was no longer a lake in the traditional sense. It was a monstrous, churning whirlpool, an angry wound in the earth consuming everything within reach. The water didn't just swirl gently, it raged, roaring like a freight train. Anyone watching from the banks would have seen entire trees, roots and all, torn from the ground and sucked into the center of the vortex. Chunks of land sheared off the edge of the shoreline, like a glacier carving into the sea. But the most surreal detail wasn't just what went in, it was how. The entire lake had become a massive natural siphon. The whirlpool pulled objects toward its center, not with dramatic splashes, but with eerie, almost graceful inevitability. Steel barges, some weighing over 300 tons, glided across the surface like leaves on a pond before spinning slowly, tipping and vanishing below. A local fisherman would later describe it as watching the world get erased. The earth itself seemed to be collapsing. On Jefferson Island, a 75-acre ridge that bordered the lake, things were just as horrifying. This was private property, home to wealthy families, a grand antebellum-style mansion, and the famed botanical gardens built by actor Joseph Jefferson in the late 19th century. As the ground eroded and the whirlpool expanded, parts of the gardens were swallowed, fountains, hedges, benches, entire groves of trees, gone. But the story didn't end with what vanished, it also includes what didn't. Incredibly, some of the barges were later spit back out by the lake days later. When the mine completely filled with water, the newly formed lake, now over 1,300 feet deep in some places, achieved equilibrium. The water pressure equalized, the violent sucking stopped, and in a scene straight out of a surrealist painting, 9 of the 11 barges re-emerged, floating calmly on the surface as though nothing had happened. It was as if the lake had chewed them up, changed its mind, and gently returned them. But what lay beneath the surface had changed forever. The diamond crystal salt mine was gone. Every tunnel, every chamber, every elevator shaft, completely flooded and permanently destroyed. What was once a geometric grid of mined caverns was now a chaotic, underwater abyss filled with silt, debris, and shattered steel. For days after the collapse, the area was considered unstable. Geologists and engineers worried about secondary collapses, further sinkholes, and new breaches forming beneath the surface. And for good reason. The geology of the region had been violently altered. Salt domes, while huge and powerful formations, are incredibly sensitive to water. Once breached, they dissolve quickly and unpredictably. What had once been rock-solid pillars of structural support were now literal holes, eroded by water, gravity, and time. The collapse of the mine had fundamentally weakened the entire area. For a while, there was fear that Jefferson Island itself might disappear into the ground. Eventually, those fears subsided. The collapse had stabilized, but the scars remained. The newly formed lake was deeper than before, hundreds of feet deeper. Its ecosystem had been obliterated. All plant and fish life that had existed in the previous shallow freshwater lake was gone, replaced by a brackish mix of freshwater and Gulf saltwater. New species would eventually move in, but the lake was no longer the same body of water. It had, quite literally, become something else. In the weeks that followed, Texaco was forced to reckon with the magnitude of the disaster. The company initially denied wrongdoing, blaming the collapse on faulty maps provided by third parties. But under intense legal pressure and public scrutiny, they ultimately agreed to a settlement, paying $32 million to Diamond Crystal Salt and $12.8 million to a nearby botanical garden that had suffered extensive damage. And remarkably, despite the collapse of an entire mine, the destruction of multiple industrial operations, the reversal of a canal, and the disappearance of a lake, not a single person died. It is to this day considered one of the most spectacular industrial accidents in American history. In the aftermath of the collapse, Lake Peigneur did not simply return to normal. It couldn't. The body of water that remained looked like Lake Peigneur on a map, but it had changed, fundamentally, chemically, and ecologically. Prior to the disaster, Lake Peigneur had been a shallow, freshwater lake. On average, it was only about 10 to 12 feet deep, a calm basin fed by rainfall and runoff, surrounded by marshland and cypress trees. But on November 20th, 1980, the entire lake drained in just a few hours into the massive cavities left behind by the salt mine, forming a vertical shaft in the earth that ultimately filled with water. In that short window, Lake Peigneur transformed from a shallow freshwater lake into the deepest lake in Louisiana, plunging to depths of over 1,300 feet at its center. To put that in perspective, it went from being a peaceful, muddy-bottomed fishing hole to a yawning chasm deeper than most American lakes east of the Rockies. And with that depth came other changes. The saltwater invasion. One of the most dramatic and long-lasting changes was chemical. As the lake drained, it created an intense drop in pressure at the surface. This sudden vacuum effect caused water from the Del Cambra Canal, which normally flowed from the lake toward the Gulf of Mexico, to reverse its course. For the first time in recorded history, the canal ran backward, pulling in not just water from the Gulf, but salt water. As millions of gallons of seawater flooded into the empty basin, the lake's ecosystem was permanently altered. The fresh water was diluted, then overrun. Brackish water, a mixture of salt water and fresh water, now dominates Lake Peigneur, and its salinity levels have never returned to what they were before 1980. It is no longer considered a freshwater lake. This change had immediate consequences for the flora and fauna. The fish species that had once thrived in the lake, largemouth bass, crappie, bluegill, channel catfish, could not survive the spike in salinity. Most either died off or migrated. The aquatic plants that had rooted in the shallow lake bed were smothered or drowned under the new, deeper, saltier conditions. The delicate ecological balance that had taken decades to form was wiped out in a matter of hours. Over time, nature returned, but differently. Brackish water is a niche environment supporting organisms adapted to the chemical imbalance between salt and fresh water. Over the next decade, new species began to colonize the altered lake. Salt-tolerant fish such as red drum and sheep's head were occasionally spotted, carried in from the Gulf by the backflow. Some Euryhaline species, fish that can survive in a wide range of salinities, began to take hold. Local fishermen reported a decline in traditional catches. They now encountered species unfamiliar to the lake's old identity. The fishing industry around Lake Peigneur suffered, not catastrophically, but noticeably. It simply wasn't the same lake anymore. And while a new fishing culture eventually emerged, it had to adapt to an alien body of water with new rhythms and new rules. The lake's increased depth also created new challenges and mysteries. Areas that had once been easily mapped and fished were now abyssal and featureless. Underwater topography changed radically. Sonar scans revealed bizarre formations and slopes, remnants of the mine's collapsed corridors, now filled with silt, debris, and seawater. Some areas are now so deep and dark that diving is considered extremely dangerous, not just because of pressure, but due to unpredictable terrain and near-zero visibility. To this day, no comprehensive survey of the lake's full underwater structure has been completed. The sheer depth and instability of the collapsed mine make it nearly impossible to map fully. What lies at the bottom, collapsed tunnels, mangled machinery, or perhaps just endless sediment is largely unknown. Above water, Jefferson Island survived, but not without scars. The botanical gardens were partially restored, though some sections were permanently lost. The estate continues to host visitors, now with the added weight of history hanging in the air. Tour guides speak not just of Joseph Jefferson's theatrical career, but of the day the ground gave way. The gardens have grown over some of the damage, but you can still see the subtle lines, the shifts in elevation, the unnatural banks where shoreline used to be. The surrounding land has largely stabilized, though it is still monitored. No one drills here anymore. The salt mine remains permanently closed, a cautionary tale sealed beneath 1,300 feet of water.